Hi, everybody. I'm Brett Copeland, Executive Director of the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and all summer we've been holding forums like this one, talking to experts largely about expanding veterans healthcare. So thank you for joining us today. And before I turn it over to our moderator, Suzanne Gordon, who is a VHPI Senior Policy Analyst, and many of you probably know her as a journalist and author of the books, The Battle for Veterans Healthcare and Wounds of War. Thank you all for being here. If you would like to get more information about future forums like this or our weekly wrap up of veterans healthcare news, please visit our website, veteranspolicy.org/subscribe. That's a once weekly newsletter that we put out every Monday morning that collects the biggest stories in veterans healthcare and puts it right in your inbox. So before we begin, I just want to give a few rules of the road. We will be taking questions in the second half of this discussion. So if you have a question, feel free to direct message me or raise your hand and we'll try and get to as many as possible. VHPI is largely funded by small dollar donations from folks like you. So if you are so willing and enjoy programs like this in our past forums, please feel, we would love it if you could go to veteranspolicy.org/donate and throw us a few bucks. We certainly enjoy talking to you all about these incredibly important issues for our veterans, and we hope that we can continue to do so in the future. So thank you if you are a past donor, and we certainly appreciate any support that you can provide. So Suzanne Gordon, of course, is a longtime healthcare reporter, and she is author, like I said, of those 2 books focused on veterans healthcare. So Suzanne, I'm going to toss it over to you.
So, I'm really excited to be doing this Zoom meeting, which is really an extension of a meeting that we had last month on bad paper discharges that disqualify veterans in different ways from accessing benefits to care and education and other needed services. And VHPI has long favored expanding the VA to all veterans, to veteran family members, and even in certain circumstances, particularly when VA facilities are underutilized, to civilians. These are often controversial ideas, very controversial in the veteran community. And in our previous Zoom meeting, we talked about other than honorable discharges and the petition that Swords to Plowshares and other groups have put before the VA about streamlining and making more welcoming the character of discharge review process within the VA. The focus has often, when we look at disqualifying discharges, the focus has often been on other than honorable discharges because of the patent unfairness of really punishing veterans who often have traumatic brain injuries or mental health conditions, or who have reported, women who have reported women or men who have reported sexual assaults and are essentially punished for a problem or for their courage. And then given what Carl Castro, who is one of our panelists, has called the mark of Cain that sort of follows them forever, not only excluding them from VA benefits, but sometimes from really getting good jobs and so forth. Danny Scherson in our last meeting talked about how as a company, a unit commander and a company commander, commanders are sort of incentivized to get undeployable troops off their books through the use of these bad paper discharges. We are also very concerned with people who have general discharges. Chris Goldsmith talked about who was in the Army and had a suicide attempt and was essentially penalized by getting a general discharge. So good news, he had access to VA benefits. Bad news, when he was kind of ready to rock and roll and go to school, he couldn't get the GI Bill. He managed to work his way through this and graduated Columbia University. But many other veterans are stuck in dead-end jobs, which many have lost in the pandemic or in a previous recession. And we feel that this really needs to be addressed. Then there's also the issue of the complex maze of eligibility requirements in the VA. I know that when I was writing my book, Wounds of War, and tried to write about how the priority groups and eligibility requirements, I would get a different answer from practically everybody I talked to. Many people in the VA, people didn't understand, who was a priority 8, who was a priority 7, what that meant, who was priority 5. And this has been documented when it comes to mental health care by a recent study by the National Academies of Science, Medicine, Engineering, and Medicine. And they showed that one of the reasons why veterans don't go to the VA is because they don't understand how to navigate these rules. They don't even understand, as Carl Castro will talk about, who is, quote unquote, a veteran. And finally, I think that these disqualifying and complex eligibility requirements feed the privatization movement, because as we've seen in the debate about the S-75, the Commander John Scott Hannon Act, many veterans advocates feel, in our view, misguidedly, that they have to support sending veterans out to the private sector because the VA's hands are tied and they just can't take care of them. Finally, we also think that these kind of rules and disqualifying discharge feed internal divisions within veterans who are debating who should be excluded, not how can we care for and serve everybody who has served our country. And this is sort of in the great tradition of the American parsing of who is the worthy poor and the worthy sick. And we feel that this has to be addressed. And we are so excited to welcome the panelists who are going to be looking at this and talking about some creative ideas about how can we address this complex issue. The first panelist, and I'm going to introduce them when they come up in order, is Carl Castro. Carl Castro is a PhD in social work. He at the University of California, Suzanne Dwork Peck School of Social Work. He's the research director for the USC Center for Innovation and Research on Veterans and Military Families. He began his career in the Army as an infantryman in 1981. He served in so many different capacities. I'm not going to say them all, but one was the director of the Military Operational Medicine Research Program at the U.S. Army Medical Research and Command. And I'm not going to keep going because it'll take too much of Carl's time. So Carl, would you speak about the issue of who is and who isn't a veteran, how we define veterans and why that matters?
Thank you, Suzanne. It's so wonderful to be here. So I think it's important to understand that, and one of the things that I have just recently wound down an activity, it's a NATO activity, looking at veteran or service members transitioning back to their civilian communities and what it means from a veteran perspective. And what can communities do, and what can veterans do, and what can the militaries do to support this transitioning process. And one of the things I think it's really, really important for everyone to understand is every country has its own definition of who's a veteran. And so if I can start on like one end of it is the United Kingdom. They probably have the most inclusive definition of who's a veteran. And that's anyone who has served a single day in uniform is a veteran. On the probably more exclusive end of the spectrum, and this is, I will say, where most nations fall, and that is you are not a veteran unless you participated in an operational deployment. So if you served in the military for 20 or 30 years and retired, but you never went on an operational deployment, then you would not be considered a veteran. You would be considered a former service member. And in between that is really where the United States falls. So our definition, and I'm going to simplify it a little bit because like all of these definitions, there are exceptions. It's basically you have to have served honorably on active duty for 2 years. So that's the basic definition. and really where discharge status becomes really important, because depending on your discharge status, you'll fall into this, you didn't serve honorably, and therefore that's how you're not considered a veteran, or if you didn't serve on active duty. There are always exceptions, like I said, and it's usually most of the exceptions are around injuries while you're on active duty. So if you were injured less than 2 years and you were separated, you'd still be a veteran and you would have a medical discharge. But broadly speaking, it's important for individuals to know that there are different definitions of a veteran. And I don't make any secret about this, I have been advocating for years that we should adopt the most inclusive definition of who's a veteran. And that one would be the one that the United Kingdom adopts, which is you serve 1 day in uniform, you're a veteran. And of course, that has lots of implications then for services you can receive. Now, to even make it more complicated, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but each state has another definition of who's a veteran. And most of those definitions involve serving in combat. So in order to be a veteran from a state perspective, you often had to have served in a combat operation, not just like a peacekeeping or humanitarian mission or something like that, or being activated to fight wildfires in California. You have to have served in a combat deployment. And then, of course, layered on top of that are all of the various nonprofit organizations. When they say, who will you support? Some of them say, we will only support OEF veterans. We won't support Vietnam veterans or Korean War veterans. There aren't very many of them, or World War II veterans now, but then they'll further define eligibility. And of course, this is really what we're talking about, because, as boring as definitions can be, it's how we determine who gets access to resources in America and in every country, actually. So it's really, really important, I think, that when we talk about who's deserving, we could, as Suzanne was saying in the introduction, we could parse this out and say, I'm more deserving than you. I actually served 4 tours in combat. You only served 1. Therefore, I should get 4 times what you have. And you can see that's kind of a slippery slope argument. And so I've just adopted this very inclusive approach. And I think as we move forward in thinking about who's a veteran and how to define a veteran, it becomes really important. And it reminds me a lot of our women veterans, who often don't identify as veterans for lots of reasons. But one of the key reasons that they will tell us is, well, I didn't serve in combat. So they have their own kind of internal definition themselves of who's a veteran. They may have deployed to Iraq. They may have been on the base camp the whole time. But since they didn't serve in combat, they don't really feel they're a veteran, or a combat veteran, or a veteran in need. And some veterans will think, well, so-and-so needs more than I do, so I shouldn't take anything. Let them get all of the help that they need. So you see kind of this self-sacrificing occurring, which I think we need to really actively work to dampen down and say, look, you served and you're deserving. So that's just kind of my motto. You served, you're deserving, everyone's included. And then when we talk about discharge status, and as Suzanne mentioned, I have talked about it being, in some cases, a mark of Cain, where depending on your discharge status, it carries with you for the rest of your life. And oftentimes things that you will not receive an honorable discharge for aren't even crimes in the civilian community. You would just get fired. You wouldn't then get labeled and then for the rest of your life have to report something that happened that nobody else would have to report. So lately I have been advocating for time limits on discharges that are not honorable discharges. And so I said, well, if you get another than honorable discharge, maybe for 6 months you have to have that title, but then it automatically changes over to an honorable discharge. And similar, we could debate what that should look like, but the idea is they don't last forever because, people change, people improve, people change their lives, and we should recognize that as we think about not only who's a veteran, but the issue of discharge status, I think is really, really important when we try to say we want them to have a successful transition back into the civilian community. And if they have this blot for a single mistake they made, and these mistakes can happen in various times in one's career. I know of staff sergeants who served 2 combat tours and did something stupid on the weekend, came up hot for drug use, and he got a bad conduct discharge. And you trying to tell me that a staff sergeant who served 10 years, served 2 combat tours, highly decorated, makes one mistake, and they're not a veteran? Sometimes these things don't even make any sense when we think about them. And unfortunately, this staff sergeant could appeal his status and, well, did the judicial system make a mistake? No, the judicial system didn't make a mistake. He actually did the drugs on the weekend and he got caught doing them. But should it be something that lasts a lifetime? And is this staff sergeant really not a veteran? I think in my own mind, this person's a veteran. You served 2 combat tours, a year long. How can you say, well, you made this one mistake and therefore that erases everything that you've done before? And I think that is really sort of the crux of the argument. I think we need to be more forgiving. We need to hold people accountable, but we also need to be more forgiving. And we need to figure out how we can do that in a humane way, a brotherhood way, a sisterhood way, because I view these individuals as veterans, and I call them veterans. And I think we need to just sort of recognize their service and support them wherever we can. So I think I'm probably out of time, Suzanne, so I will stop there for questions at the end or for the next speaker.
So I just want to ask you one quick question, Carl, because yesterday when we were talking this meeting, you talked about an interesting idea that I think also involves a sort of expansion of VA, which is bringing service members, active duty service members into the VA before, I'm not going to tell the idea. You could talk about, 6 months.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I personally experienced when I went through the TAP program and was leaving the military is that a lot of service members who are leaving, they actually, we don't talk about this a lot because it's not really pleasant, but a lot of junior enlisted in particular, they leave the military and they're angry. And it's really a reflection of when do they sign up for their next contract. And there's usually a reason why you don't sign your next contract. It could be because I'm going to go on and get a college education, or I only signed up to go on one deployment and that's it. But a lot of times soldiers don't renew their contract because they're angry at their most recent NCO that they work for. And so they come to the TAP program not in the best of learning moods, I would say. Some of them are very angry, some are scared, and they just don't want to do anything with the military. They won't get a health checkup because they don't want anyone to find out something's wrong with them, and then that will delay them leaving the military. And so one of the things that we could do, and thus they won't go to the VA because they attribute the VA as the military, and they don't want anything to do with the military. That's why they're leaving the military. The last thing they want to do is go to a place they're trying to avoid. And so one of the things that I was thinking about, well, what could help facilitate that? And I think what could really help is if active duty service members, 6 months before they leave the service, they receive their last 6 months of health care through the VA. This way, it would familiarize them with the VA. All of their records would be transitioned to the VA. The VA would be able to do health checkups on them and determine everything that happened to them while they were on active duty. So they won't always trying to be proving it's service connected, because these evaluations would be done with enough lead time to carefully document service connection, health issues, etc. And also, I think it would show to the service member who's separating, the VA is really a great organization. It's not a perfect organization. No organization is perfect, but it would show them, oh, this is really not as bad as I thought it was, because we always tend to repeat the war stories, the bad things that happen, and we rarely talk about successes. And the way people learn about successes is experiencing them themselves. And so I just think this would help in the whole transition, by the way, because then they would have more seamless care because you'd always have the active duty backup. And I know there's a lot of logistical issues and things that would have to be worked out for a plan like this to work, but I think it could work, and I think it would really work, more importantly, to the benefit of the veteran. The organizations would have to change how they conduct business. I'm always less concerned about that as I'm concerned about what's best for the veteran, what's best for the service member.
Thank you, Carl. So I think that was really exciting, and I look forward to the question period where we discuss some of this more fully. The next person, I'm so excited to welcome Catherine Becker Van Haest, who is a dear friend and colleague, and she works for Senator Bernie Sanders, directing now his Burlington, Vermont state operation. Of course, we know that Bernie has been an enormous champion for veterans. He was the chair of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, and Katie is an expert on veterans issues and veterans affairs, as well as having a really broad understanding of the American healthcare system, which is, I think, very rare on Capitol Hill to marry those two, and has been an enormous help to me. And Catherine is going to talk about what would it look like legislatively? I mean, what would we have to do legislatively if we had the determination to include all veterans? I mean, Carl has some ideas. Other people have had ideas about pilot programs of including this group or that group. And then Catherine and I have talked a lot about how would you change Title 38? And so you are tasked with solving this in 15 minutes, which I know you can do.
No problem. If that it were that easy. Thank you so much, Suzanne, Brett, and everyone for having me here today. It's great to be with you. In typical 2020 fashion, my neighbor just decided to start mowing their lawn. So if there's some background noise, my apologies. But that is, I feel like 2020 in a nutshell right now. And I see a lot of familiar names here on the screen. So I know that a lot of you have lived experience, know a lot about what I'm talking about from the legislative perspective, but I really appreciate having the chance to talk through a little bit of this with you. So as Suzanne said, I worked for Bernie when he was the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee when we negotiated the Veterans Access, Choice, and Accountability Act of 2014. But he's been a long-standing supporter of veterans and the VA for some time before his chairmanship, and ongoing, of course, after that. And I think in reality, I want to just kind of widen the lens a little bit to put some of this discussion around resources into a broader context of how we tend to look at federal benefits and services writ large in this country. The discussion we're having around VA privatization very closely mirrors a lot of the discussions that we have on Capitol Hill when it comes to privatization of Social Security, the privatization of Medicare under certain Medicare Advantage programs, the privatization of the US Postal Service that we are all talking about right now, and the requirements that legislators put in place that either make that privatization more likely or less likely. And the reality of it is that the vast majority of this quite simply comes down to dollars. And the seriousness with which we are willing to discuss the expansion of benefits to all veterans really comes down to what resources we're willing to commit to that expansion. There's wonderful veterans organizations who have done tremendous work to ensure that certain subsets of the veterans population get priority, are ensured that they will get care. And that work has been tremendously important, largely because resources are limited. If resources were expanded, then access could be expanded. And so what do I mean by that? I think that this covers every single segment of the VA. I'm going to focus primarily on the healthcare segment, but obviously, because right now, part of the way we address access to healthcare is tied directly to service-connected disabilities, we can't entirely forget the VBA side of things, but I'm going to kind of leave that off to the side to some extent, just for the sake of time and brain power. But one of the examples that I always love to give, and that Bernie talks a lot about when we talk about expanding access, is access only matters if you have the infrastructure to support it. And so what does that mean? It means the physical plant of the VA healthcare system. So our medical centers, our community-based outpatient clinics, and it also means our staff and who work in these healthcare settings. Some of the most recent data shows that we have somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 vacancies within the VA. Those vacancies are actually a pretty conservative estimate because they only consider those positions that are actively being recruited for. Now, there's a certain number of that that's just general churn of any employer of this size. But there's also a whole host of positions that we could use that the VA isn't actually advertising for because of budget constraints. So it's not because of demand, it's not because of need, it is simply because the VA is dependent upon the budget that they are given from Congress, and they can only work within the confines of that budget. Now, we could spend another 4 hours on how that budget is defined, but simply put, the VA's budget is largely determined off what has happened in prior years. So it's based off of the existing population of veterans using the services, how much services they're using, and where they're receiving them. And so if you are going to actually look seriously at expanding VA access, you have to be willing to take a much broader view, as Senator Sanders has done, to consider how we would even determine that budget to begin with. Because you'll hear members of Congress say consistently, we raise the VA's budget every year. And it's something that members on both sides of the aisle are regularly willing to tout, that the VA's budget is one of the few budgets in Congress that consistently increases year over year. But I would argue that just because we've expanded the budget year over year does not mean that the budget is actually sufficient to serve the existing population of veterans, let alone the population of prior service members who are not currently accessing the VA. So I spoke briefly about staff. The other key piece is the physical infrastructure, the bricks and mortar, as well as the telehealth services that we know now are so important to actually provide the care. Now, you'll hear members of Congress, folks who favor privatization, talk regularly about the fact that our infrastructure is crumbling. Now, I've walked into some beautiful VA medical centers and CBOCs around the country and in every corner of the United States, and some facilities abroad as well. There are also ones that are in desperate need of rehabilitation and services. We are fortunate in Congress in that every year we get an assessment of what those needs are. One of the most recent budget assessments suggested there was upwards of $60 to $70 billion of infrastructure investments needed in the VA. I'm going to say that number again because I think it gets missed most of the time. So we are told by VA that we need between $60 and $70 billion of infrastructure investment made. Now, I'm going to tell you, Congress has never met the full infrastructure need of the VA. And so there's no way to actually suggest that we are really investing in veterans care the way we need to be if we are leaving that much unmet need on the table. And so it is incumbent, I think, upon anyone who is serious about wanting to expand veterans' access to VA to actually make those infrastructure investments that are needed, because we cannot have, and this is, yet again, another sort of piece of the playbook for those who favor privatization of federal benefits and services, if you starve that entity, department, of the resources it needs, then you're making the argument for privatization, because as those services are less quality, less timely, it makes the argument for privatization for you. Of course, the other side of the story you're not telling is that that starvation is happening on purpose. And so that's just sort of like a piece of what's behind a lot of this. And I would say too, that from Bernie's perspective, when we talk about healthcare in this large bucket, I think it's important to define to some extent what we mean. I think the greatest number of veterans have access to physical healthcare services. A growing population do also have access to comprehensive mental health care services. And to some extent, we've actually been willing to expand those services in recent years more than we have for physical health, which in some ways makes great logical sense, because we've recognized, I think, both on the DoD and the VA side of the house, that we have a crisis in suicide and mental health amongst our veteran and service member population, and that we have to address it. And so I would certainly suggest that it is imperative that we continue to provide a full complement of mental health services to all veterans and all service members. But I think the piece that often gets left out is that the veterans who are often in the best mental health state and who have the least likely chances of having suicidal ideations are those who are enrolled in VA healthcare. And they are enrolled in the full complement of VA healthcare. And so I think when we look at the statistics around veteran suicide, we can't do that without looking at what's actually working and how we expand that. And then the last piece, I think, from again Bernie's lens, that is particularly important when we talk about expanding healthcare access, is looking at dental care. Dental care gets left out all the time. I've been told, countless times that nobody cares about dental care. Dental care isn't sexy. Forget it. But the reality is that I think anyone with a healthcare background knows, and frankly, anyone with a mouth knows, that your oral health care is incredibly important, and it is tied to the rest of your physical health. We have documentation all over the place about the risk of infection to cardiovascular health. We also know that having quality oral health care and good looking teeth can impact your ability to get a job, can impact depression rates. So there is so much interconnectedness with dental care and the rest of our bodies, but yet the subset of veterans that are actually eligible for VA dental care is extremely, extremely small. And so I would suggest, and Bernie has fought for this consistently in Congress, that if we are going to truly address expansion of healthcare for veterans, that also needs to include full comprehensive dental care as part of that. So I've veered a little bit off of my task probably, but I would just suggest that at the end of the day, the vast majority of this really comes down to a willingness of Congress to dedicate the resources necessary. And then once that happens, it's actually relatively simple to make the legislative changes in the text, in the statute, to fully expand access to veterans of all eras, discharge status, et cetera. So I'll leave it there.
I'm going to just ask you, before we open it up to questions, I do want to make one comment before we do that, but I want to ask you, what is the relatively simple fix? So if we could, wave a magic wand and we would get a commitment to really caring for veterans, and let's just start with veterans because not even their families, but what is the relatively simple legislative fix?
Sure. So right now, basically, eligibility for VA healthcare is defined in Title 38, Section 1710. That's the statutory reference. And so legislators can draft whatever legislation they want to strike that definition, write in a new definition, and then that is the reference point for all carry-on services and benefits from there. So that's sort of the easiest fix is right there in 1710. And 1710 of Title 38 is really where we get the priority groups from, where it defines, prisoners of war, Purple Heart, 100% service connected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, including the income limits. And so, from the most simple perspective, you could strike the income limits and go on from there. And so there's also ways, I should say, that this can be done without actually interfering with the existing priority group levels. So, if you are an advocate for service-connected disabled veterans and your goal is to ensure that those veterans always are at the top of the list for care, you can expand VA access without jeopardizing the rights of those veterans who have obviously given so much for our country.
Thank you so much. So I just want to make one quick comment before opening it up to questions, and that is, I think what's interesting about the Commander Scott Hannon Act and also the entire VA privatization discussion, it was clear, if folks followed the deliberations of the Commission on Care, that certain people in Congress are quite willing to expand the amount of money that we spend on veterans care, as long as that care is delivered by the private sector. And, it really makes no sense to say, even in this very small experiment and giving grants to private sector mental health providers, it makes no sense to say, the government will pay for your health care if you can't go to the VA, and then not say the government will pay for your health care if you go to the VA. I mean, I suppose I shouldn't be partisan, but there's a certain amount of hypocrisy in that, like there is in the discussion about who's nominated to the Supreme Court and approved or brought forward. But I really think that we have to constantly point this up, that there is a willingness to pay more, as long as you're not paying it to the public sector. And that's a precedent that I think we can build on.
Suzanne, we actually have Rick Weidman on. If you want to go to him before we get to questions. I think he's
excited. Thank you. I'm so excited, Rick. So Rick Weidman is, I'm sorry, I let folks go on and on because I thought Rick was some problem. Rick is the Vietnam veteran who served as a medical corps in the Vietnam War. He was the co-founder of Vietnam Veterans of America and is currently executive director for policy and government affairs at the VA. So Rick, why don't you respond to whatever you heard or what you have to say about this?
Well, first, my apologies. I am very much among the technically challenged. And so I have been trying to get on to this meeting since 10:01 Eastern time. Anyway, I'm here. I don't know what has preceded. I don't want to be redundant. So give me a quick brief, if you would please, Suzanne. Suzanne.
Carl Castro defined how we talked about how we define a veteran and expanding that to include anyone who served in the military, a la the UK definition. Catherine Becker Van Heest in Bernie's office talked about, if you're going to expand VA care, you need to expand the resources and the infrastructure. And she also talked about how you could change Title 38, section 1710, where we define a veteran. And so now we need your words of wisdom about perhaps why we need to do this and how we could do this and how maybe the VSO community and veterans could be brought in on this to support this.
Well, first of all, I think what is past time to do is any veteran who served, particularly those who served in theater, to the VA system for healthcare. period. Whether or
you
not,
Can you just sit like that because we're losing your face? Yeah, that's great. All right,
and such a non-pretty face it is.
it's a great
The
face.
denying people access, and particularly because of the income standard, if you're not already service connected, there's a huge group of veterans, one who has bad paper or less than other than honorable discharge, often for specious reasons. They didn't get along with a particular NCO or a commanding officer, or what happened during Vietnam was guys on 3-year enlistments went to Vietnam, often in combat MOSs, came back and had less than a year to go. So they got stuck at a military base and had a bad attitude towards second lieutenants, etc., who had never been anywhere, trying to lock their heels. And so it was, so a lot of people ended up with bad paper, and the Army didn't want us because they knew we weren't going to re-enlist and go back. So we were expendable, and they expended us. So that there was almost 900,000 less than honorable discharges during the Vietnam War. Many of them should have been upgraded right then. And ever since since 74, John Rowan, who's now VBA National President, and I had been working on discharge upgrade projects to get people's discharge upgraded to honorable. It is even more egregious today in the current wars because so many people were thrown out for specious reasons, and women were thrown out with other than honorable discharges because they refused to not file for sexual assault and or sexual harassment. And so because they wouldn't drop the charges, boom, they put them out. Must have a personality disorder. And so it was the system is rife with abuse for young soldiers, young sailors, young air people, and young Marines. You'll never convince me that almost 12% of people who enlisted in the Marine Corps after 9/11 were guys who were bums. I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. And I was not a Marine. I was an Army medic. And there's a whole different mindset, but that's not the point. The point is that most of them were decent kids. And the fact that they became non-decent kids in some cases was due to the way in which they were treated in the Marine Corps and the things to which they were exposed. Not only violence repeatedly, but dehumanization repeatedly, and often toxins. So you have a huge number of people out here who were suffering toxic effects. There are Vietnam veterans who are my age, who separated from the military more than 50 years ago, but are debilitated now because of things related to Agent Orange and or other toxic exposures. So, and yet they say, well, somehow you're not worthy of receiving medical care. And that is baloney. It's baloney. And many of those folks have already died, bankrupting their families because VA drags its feet and makes up excuses to deny claims. And they do that, they call it develop to deny. In other words, they keep developing until they find some excuse not to grant the claim. Nobody, and I mean literally nobody, has ever been fired from the Contribution and Pension Service because they said no. No is a default position on every claim. And if they're under pressure to their production, which they often are, they just say no. And and nobody ever challenges that. The individual may appeal, and if they have a good service officer or they have a good pro bono attorney, they may prevail, and oftentimes do, because often it's clear and unmistakable error. And why did the adjudicator make that mistake? Because he or she was under enormous pressure to keep their, because of their home situation, and they didn't have time to properly adjudicate it, or properly didn't have the time to wait for the evidence to show up. So they didn't develop an order to grant, which is what they're supposed to do by law. They developed an order to deny. So hinging access to the medical system on such a flawed and arbitrary system as the comp and pen system is just wrong. And a lot of people have been denied claims and died before their time because of that denial. And frankly, it's outrageous. And it continues to be outrageous.
Can I just ask you, so how, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you change Title 38, how you define a veteran? Would you get Congress to set up pilot programs? How would you go about this if we were to move forward, understanding the complexities of the problem? Oops.
Well, borrow, and that's dishonorable discharge. A dishonorable discharge can only be given as a result of a general court martial. But that's not how most bad paper is. Most of it is simply other than honorable discharge. Doesn't mean that the person's not honorable, doesn't mean they acted badly. And in one case I know of, a young man came home, they refused to let him go on sick call, and he tried to kill himself and was thrown out with bad paper. You talking about an egregious case. I mean, but that is symptomatic of the problem bad paper, particularly among the young, them healthcare because of that. And often the situation, by the way, has to do with the short fuse that people who have PTSD, who've seen a lot of combat, in many cases way too much combat, and been sent back for a second and third tour, without volunteering for it, and been put back out on patrol as a grunt while they're on medication for their PTSD. I mean, that's just crazy. And it's overriding good medical judgment. And oftentimes it's a commanding officer who takes and writes return to duty, no matter what the physician may have said. And then they get thrown back out in the field. And then they wonder why the kids break, because that's essentially what it is. And then they throw them out. And particularly when they started downsizing the size of the arms in the Army and to some degree in the Marine Corps, they wanted to throw people out so they could bring more people in. And that was also true during Vietnam. If you were a problem, it was easiest to get rid of you by here, sign here, and you can go home. And the sign here was for a summary court martial that resulted in your being put out with a less than honorable discharge. And it was just wrong. It was wrong 40, 50 years ago, and it's wrong today.
So I'm going to interrupt you, Rick, and because I think you've really explained, along with Carl and Catherine, the situation, and we're running short on time, and I really want to get some questions in. I think some of the panelists will stay if after the hour, if folks have more questions. But Brett, do you want to open it up to questions?
Sure. And again, if you have a question, please raise your hand or shoot it to me in the text box and the chat box, and I'd be happy to ask it for you. We actually have the first question talking about the inclusion of families within veterans care. Typically, big VSOs had opposed the inclusion of families, citing restrictions of VHA use. Is it time to reassess kind of that position, especially among the VSO community, and what role would they play in that debate moving forward? So to any of the panelists, I'll open up your mics.
Carl, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, so this is another topic that I feel very, very strongly about. So if you serve in the military, every commander, every politician, every advocate will say the family is just as important as the service member in sustaining them to do their mission. They say you enlist a soldier, but you re-enlist a family. So all of these things indicates that the military places a very, very high value on the family. However, the status of the family is completely and totally linked to the status of the service member and the veteran. So if a service member gets a bad conduct discharge, the family doesn't get any benefits either, because their discharge status is linked to the service member's discharge status. And this comes back to definitions. It's how can we define the status of a family that's independent of the status of the service member or veteran? And I always say that linking those two harkens back to biblical days, where the head of the clan, everyone got punished. If the clan chief did something bad, everyone was punished. We did away with debtor prisons, right? But we still punish the family in many ways because of this discharge status issue. And so I think that families should be receiving some care. And we can always, I'm now very conscious now of the conversation around, well, we need more resources if we're going to do that. I do not believe that families should only get care if it benefits the service member or the veteran. I think families should get care because it benefits them personally. If I'm a spouse of a veteran or a service member, I should get care because of me, not because of, well, I can help the service member do a better job. And it really gets back to something that we talked about, Suzanne, about what do we think about healthcare? Is healthcare a right that we all should enjoy as Americans, or is healthcare a benefit, like a paid vacation? And if we view it as a benefit, then you're probably never going to supporting families and getting them help and when they need it. But if you view healthcare as a right that every American is entitled to, then I think you shift the conversation. But I don't even know if we've had the right conversation around, is healthcare a right or is it a benefit? And we even brag about our healthcare like we went on a vacation. Oh, I went on a great vacation. I had a great time. Oh, I went to the healthcare and I had a great doctor and I got great services. Well, we all should get great healthcare and great services. We shouldn't be talking about healthcare like we're on a great vacation. But that's sort of how it's evolved over time in America, which is also very different compared to the rest of the world. So again, it's this different approach, but is it really meeting the needs of, in this case, veterans and their families? And I think the VA, if the VA couldn't handle expanding services to anyone who served, I don't see how they could ever expand to provide services for family members. But we need to work on it.
Catherine or Rick, do you want to take the same question or?
Sure, I can. Rick, go ahead.
No, go ahead, ma'am.
Great to see you. Obviously, so I have a boss who believes pretty fervently that healthcare is in fact a human right and has a piece of legislation, Medicare for All, to address just that. And I think that Carl, said it when he said that if we can't talk about the VA expanding access to all veterans, it's very difficult to consider expanding access to family members. That being said, we've had programs for decades like CHAMP VA that have provided some healthcare services to some family members with a lot of success. And we've also had programs like what can happen through vet centers where family members can be part of the care of a particular veteran based on a particular sort of subset of needs. That being said, I think one of the things that I'm conscious of that Bernie is as well, is that there are lots of times when we have asked the VA to step up because other departments within the federal government have not. And I think that we run the risk of healthcare being a very similar thing if we are unwilling to look at something like Medicare for All. The example that I would give that I often do is looking at the care and services that are provided to veterans at Camp Lejeune, who were caused tremendous harm by the Department of Defense. And when the Department of Defense was unwilling to provide any compensation or services to those individuals, it ended up being the VA that bore the brunt of providing those services. Now, there is no question in my mind that those service members, those Marines and their families who were harmed by the toxic exposures at Camp Lejeune should have been, and it is good that they are, being compensated for what happened to them. But whether that belongs on VA's books, I think is a question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think, you know, that's very much similar to the discussions we're having now around burn pit exposure. Obviously, all of the discussions we've had for decades around Agent Orange exposure, we have asked VA to bear the brunt of what has happened within other departments of the federal government. And so we're very willing to commit the resources necessary on the DoD side. And so I think it's a challenge when we then fail to commit those same resources on the VA side. And I think that expansion of healthcare to family members, there's a parallel there that I think it's important to talk about. The last thing I would just mention super quickly is VA's caregiver program. And obviously that is within the confines of providing services to family members because it benefits the veteran. So it is a step removed of that, looking at healthcare as a human right. But the caregiver program has been extremely beneficial to the families that it has served, though I would argue, as I know Bernie would, that we need to do better on that program too.
Rick? Rick, I've asked to unmute there.
Unmute.
Yep, perfect.
PVA is strongly in support of the new law expanding the caregiver program. There are a lot of our members and other Vietnam veterans who are alive today because their wife has been taking care of them for the last 50 years. And so, but without any recompense from the government, and basically saving that expense that it costs to institutionalize somebody. Which is really what the caregiver program does. It's better for them to stay in their home, and it saves an enormous amount of money for the government. Along those lines, Champ VA is a proven model. And there are two things that VVA is not necessarily for opening up the VA to family members, but we are in favor of expanding Champ VA to all family members where needed. And the reason for that is that VA is fundamentally failing in doing its proper job of having people on their clinical staff educated to recognize things that are service related, because they don't train them. And they don't even train, even though almost two thirds of young doctors do at least one rotation on either internship or residency at a VA hospital. VA doesn't educate them in the wounds, maladies, injuries, and conditions resulting from military service, particularly in hazardous conditions. And so they don't know. And that's why civilian doctors don't recognize often what they're looking at, because nobody's ever taught them that in their medical training. That is not a passive oversight. That's a deliberate oversight on the part of VA. And it's been a requirement for years, since the early 80s, that they take a military history and use it in the diagnosis and treatment modalities. The only place that does that is the vet centers. And it's also the vet centers are the only place that legally can treat those family members. We have a saying that it's the veteran who gets injured or ill, but it's the whole family that has to recover. And that is a truism, particularly on neuropsychiatric wounds, but also on other things. But on the emotional and neuropsychiatric level, if you're not working with the spouse, if there is a spouse, or significant other, if there isn't a formal spouse, it's a something that really needs to be done to include them in that treatment plan, because without which it's going to be limited progress on the part of the veteran, whether he or she gets better and stays better or not. So we're in favor of expanding CHAMP VA, and this is my quick answer.
Thank you. Ann Sheets asks if there are racial inequities in less than honorable discharges.
I'm going to take a stab at that. I think Carl needs to go. Carl, you need to go. Is that correct? Am I muted?
No.
Yes, and I apologize for that. I could stay on for the rest of the day. This is so exciting. I love talking about these topics. So I really apologize to everyone. And please feel free to reach out to me at any point to carry on the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us. I don't have the stats in front of me, maybe Catherine does, but I know that there are definite racial disparities and also sort of gender disparities in how many other than honorable discharges and general discharges are given to people of color. And obviously, this is a serious women's issue. I don't know if Kayla Williams is still on the line or joining us, but is Kayla still there?
Kayla had to take
Okay.
off.
But you know, there are definite racial disparities in, and I wish I had the statistics at my fingertips about the unfair discharges. And certainly,
So if you go to our website, actually, veteranspolicy.org, we talk a lot about this in our last forum on OTH discharge and general discharge status. And in there, we've linked to a report called Turned Away that lays out a lot of the disparities in regards to discharge status. So if you go to veteranspolicy.org, it should be right there on the front page, kind of under the advertisement for this forum. Our next question is from Ali Parand. Maintaining high standards of competence and integrity within VA central office is necessary to ensure efficient use of funds and to counter ongoing attempts at privatization. How can we ensure that both Congress and the OIG will do an adequate job of maintaining oversight and accountability in the future?
Katie, how about you taking that one?
Well, gee, thanks for the softball. I'm not sure that I have the answer for this one. I think I'm glad that the questioner specifically mentioned the OIG, the Office of the Inspector General. That office is hugely important in any agency within the federal government, including the VA. I think that the VA Office of Inspector General has played an absolutely critical role, not just in their general requirements around oversight of what's happening at individual medical centers throughout the country, the audits that they do, but also looking at central office. You know, it's hard for me to not be partisan in this answer, which I actually don't want to be, but I think that the reality is that we need people in public service who believe in government. We need people within agencies and departments who believe that they are there to serve the public good and to serve the people that their agencies serve. And I think I've been in government for almost 2 decades, and I am not sure that I have seen before, and it certainly wasn't true when I started my career, there were disagreements within parties about how to best provide that public good, but not about whether to provide that public good. And I think that we are, to some extent, in a new era where there are those within agencies, including at the highest levels, who do not believe that those agencies should exist, let alone do their job. And so I think it's very important and certainly a requirement of Congress that we ensure that oversight is maintained and that accountability exists. When I served on the Veterans Affairs Committee, one of the things that committee staff does that I think not a lot of folks kind of know about in the general public is we have an oversight responsibility. Part of what the committee, the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee does, one of our jobs is oversight. And so as part of that job, committee staff go out to different medical centers and CBOCs and VBA administrating offices and see what's going on. On the House side, they have an Office of Investigations whose job it is to do that oversight work. So I think part of what can be done also from kind of a grassroots level is that individual American people at every level can hold Congress accountable for whether or not they're doing that oversight. Because while it falls in the requirement of the agency to do the right thing, it also is beholden upon Congress to actually do the oversight to ensure that that work is being done. So, I don't have a great answer, but that's kind of the best I've got.
I want to add something to that, which is I think that oversight, I think we need to expand the definition of oversight, because we now define the definition of oversight, certainly in terms of the VEA, entirely negatively. And so Congress is overseeing problems. The OIG reports are all about problems. And, when you manage or direct or are the CEO of an institution, whether it's a small company or a big company, part of your job is to show what people are doing right. And if you actually want people to rectify mistakes, like one of the big things you do is you say, Joe, that was great. And maybe over there you could improve, but there is absolutely no discussion whether at the highest executive level or the lowest level of what the VA is doing right. And then there, I think, is pretty lax oversight even when it's doing wrong and needs to be improved. I mean, we saw this just now with the OIG report on the Memphis VA and a suicide at the Memphis VA, which completely got it wrong because the suicide was a failure of the Mission Act. This was a failure of the Mission Act, and what people have been warning would be gaps in coordination of care in the private sector, which does not coordinate care, and a veteran fell through. And the oversight is so narrowly defined that they don't challenge the fundamental assumption of the Mission Act and just say, well, this can be solved with processes. And they can't, you can't put into place processes that fix the fragmented care in the private sector. So I think we have to redefine oversight.
May I add to that Suzanne, you're right on that, because the IG staff all too often thinks oversight is to prevent fraud, as opposed to whether or not VA is doing what it was intended to do and provide quality care in a timely manner. An example of that, something that we went through relatively recently, was last fall, was we got finally an OIG investigation of the spina bifida program. The spina bifida program is one of the earliest birth defects, and actually one of the few birth defects that are recognized due to Agent Orange exposure and other toxins in Vietnam, is spina bifida. And they were doing a terrible job in denying most cases. The same person who was denying and was responsible for not training their staff and supervising them properly, which resulted in all these denials of people in absolutely desperate straits, was the same person who was convicted of setting up fake corporations and stealing several $1,000,000. Well, once that was done, when we asked them to look at the data as to whether people were getting what they were supposed to be done, they came back and said, we found no evidence of fraud. And we said, that's not the point. The real fraud here is not providing for these young people, some of whom are now in their 40s, who were grievously injured from birth by their parents' exposure to herbicides in the military. They were never in the military, and they never volunteered to go to Vietnam, but they were deeply wounded by it. And so it is the omission that was missed. And I think that's what Suzanne is saying. It's sexy for the IG to say we saved the government $1 billion when we recovered. It's not sexy to say we saved 1,000 veterans from getting less than adequate care. It's harder to quantify. And frankly, the press tends to seize on the negative, not on the positive. So when they do something positive, they're not trumpeting it. And so I think that that's what should be part of the mission of the IG, is to say what are the best practices they found. And that should be replicated everywhere. And that's what's really lacking in a systematic way.
Well, thank you all so much. Our panelists and moderators have been so generous with our time, as have all of you, for sticking with us through this VHPI forum. If you want to watch this again, please visit veteranspolicy.org/subscribe and sign up for our email newsletter that goes out Mondays. If you want to watch it now, it is going to be posted here pretty immediately to our YouTube page, where it's live or being live broadcast currently. Thank you all from the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute and all of our board members. It was a pleasure speaking to you today. I hope you will tune in to future forums. And if you like the content that you've seen here and the discussion that we've been having, if you would toss a few bucks to VHPI through veteranspolicy.org/donate. Thank you again to Rick Weidman, Catherine Van Haast, Carl Castro, and Suzanne Gordon for this incredible discussion today. We hope to see you again here at VHPI.